Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. Okay, so we are continuing down a particular path of explaining a lot of different labels like ADD, dyslexia. Down the road, we'll be talking about oppositional defiance, all these things that are really plaguing our children today. This time, what I'm going to bring into our conversation is about stress, meltdowns, anxiety, and even touching even more on PTSD, emotional dysregulation, things like that. So it'll be several different podcasts over the next few weeks. But for right now, that kind of gives you the big picture of where we're going, because today what we're going to talk about is a fundamental piece, I believe, to be part of how all of those things can happen. And while I think sometimes we get so focused on only looking at information with the very words that maybe have been diagnosed or suspected, like anxiety or meltdowns or PTSD, that we have to get a broader perspective, and knowing that there's a touch of the same thing in all of those words, and getting a foundational piece I think is really important, because there's a lot of great information out there. And sometimes if we don't see the very word, we don't engage with the information. For example, this is completely off topic, but I think it's a good example because I know what it did for me when I was looking at this particular area. So, all of these kids that have had strep in their history, the bacterial infection, and how now it's considered common, almost like attention deficit. And there's nothing common about having strep, especially if we utilize a very traditional approach of antibiotics in order to kill the bacteria to bring homeostasis. So, an antibiotic is great, not putting down the medical profession. But if it's not an antibiotic that is specific, they're typically going to give broad spectrum. And when they do that, it really changes the environment inside of the gut, and it makes it incredibly easy for the bacteria to linger around. And the longer it lingers around, it mutates and it hides. And over time, you can maybe not have the symptoms of strep throat, but you've actually got a bacterial infection growing inside of your body, and eventually it's going to impact your brain. And when you look at the diagnosis of pandas and pans, one of the things that has been considered is history of strep infection. And if you were only looking for information about pandas, pediatric autoimmune disorder, you might miss the boat that it has everything to do with strep infections. If you're only looking for the word strep infection or strep throat, you might miss all the research that's out there, and experiences, not just research. Research is great, but especially there, to me, there's so much more information coming out today about how people are censored, and if you don't have the right narrative, then your information is taken off. And there is a lot to be said about reading just a case study where somebody had an experience either with a provider or with a patient for something that you or your family went through and this was the outcome. Even if it wasn't, 500 people involved, it might match your situation. So I want us to keep that in mind as we talk about stress and meltdowns and eventually anxiety and emotional dysregulation and PTSD, that these are all part of a very common response system. And you know me, I'm always bringing everything back to development, especially because we are talking about children. And I want you to realize how close these little cherubs are to the beginning of their life. And so when we look at the foundation of emotion, we have to realize that it is completely linked to where you are at the beginning of your life. And at the beginning of your life, you are completely dependent on caregivers. And I really want to also talk to caregivers and not just focus on the child melting down, but more importantly, the dynamics that can also create this. And then I really want to speak to young couples that want to start a family, a husband and a wife, a man and a woman who want to celebrate their love and make a baby. You really need to plan to have this baby. So those are the areas that I'm going to focus on first, which I believe is going to be a foundation for the rest of the topics within this little grouping of brain issues or developmental issues, such as meltdowns and emotional regulation. So let's kind of start off with the child. I can remember years ago, I was asked to come speak to a group about why do kids have meltdowns? And I remember when I was putting this information together, I remember how that came together. And there's so much of it when we're talking about little toddlers that we have to realize really has a lot to do with us as the adult caregiver in their life. And I remember I spoke very briefly, maybe 5 or 10 minutes on the child's part. And then I looked to all the parents in the room and I said, okay, now the rest is on you because you are managing these little beings. So, what do I really mean by that? So, again, we've talked about a lot of things with stress and how we come into the world. We are fully formed, but we're not fully functioning. So, that little baby that you have in your arms or planning to have in your arms, they are really controlled by their brain stem. And then this is also where survival exists, as well as all the primitive reflexes and all the cranial nerves. Everything about surviving is in that brainstem. And as I just mentioned, when you come into this world, you are completely dependent on your caregiver. You can't do anything for yourself. You can sleep, you can cry, you can receive your food, you can be changed, you can be held. All of those things are completely in the reliance of whoever is taking care of that little baby. So, when we're talking about children, toddlers, babies, we have to realize that as the adult, we set the tone for them. One of the really important parts of kind of setting the regulation of the child really is beginning back during pregnancy. And that's why I was saying I also want to speak to couples that are planning on starting a family. And I really want to underline the word planning. I can tell you, especially with everything that has gone on in the last few years and the heightened stress that we seem to be in today, everybody really kind of needs to know what their state of health is. If you were planning on having a baby and you noticed that you had anxiety, what environment are you creating in order for that baby to grow in? And we are exchanging. We used to think that that wasn't possible, and now we know that it's literally just some receptors that help maintain the womb, and help maintain the mother. And but it can be broken down. It's just receptors. And so what we have to think about, what's really going on inside, and what kind of environment are we setting up. So just for a second, imagine if we're speaking about the environment that the baby, the life, is going to be developed in. What would that be like for a mom who's made a decision that she needs to give her baby up for adoption? What's going on for a woman that maybe is all by herself? One of the things I've always said is that regardless of a woman's drive and motivation, I have never met a woman who has not imagined the white picket fence and that typical life of mom and dad and kids, and great home life, and financially set, and family vacations. I don't believe there is a woman out there that wouldn't want that. So what would it be for her if she's by herself? What is it if the woman who is supported and married and has a family, but there's a loss? In fact, the research that was really some research that really did a deep dive on autism, one of the things that they found, this was back in maybe like the 90s, that one of the hardest things for a woman to go through is suffering a loss. And what would that do to her chemistry? And a loss can be defined on so many levels. Maybe it is the loss of a mom or a dad, somebody that you would really want to be part of this time of your life. Maybe it is the loss of the picket fence. Maybe it is the loss of a job. There's so many things that come underneath that word, suffering a loss, but it has a huge impact on the chemistry of the chemistry of the woman, and therefore a very deep impact on the developing baby. And there is even research out there that is talking about how the babies are typically fussier. They typically are delayed. They're not reaching their milestones, typical milestones. There's greater irritability. There's more colic. Their sleep is so dysregulated. So as a healthcare culture, we've already been looking at that. And that's why I talk about the baby's blueprint and how important it is to look at that history and realize that that's the feedback mechanism that's going in to that little person's development. Two interesting experiences that I had. One probably back in about 2009 or 10, a woman had recently experienced a miscarriage and really wanted to get pregnant again, and came to see me. And at that time, I only had one piece of neurofeedback equipment, but it really was one of my fundamental pieces, because what it measures is a stress response in the person. And you're looking at the brain, you're looking at the heart rate variability, skin conduction, temperature, muscle tone, and breathing. And you're able to identify chronic patterns of stress. And I can only imagine how much stress she was going through. But when we looked at the outcome or the report, everything was off the chart, meaning standards of deviation away from typical. And in fact, they were over 4. The paper only registers up to -4, and she was past that. So there was an incredible state of stress for this woman, and that would not be the right time to work on conceiving. If I was in that state, there's a very high chance that you're not a hospitable environment to conceive. But then what does that do to the woman if she's constantly trying and can't get pregnant? I mean, what I'm really trying to demonstrate is the amount of stress inside of the mom to be. What is that going to do to the baby? And we really need to understand that, because there are neurological things going on in the wiring of the baby, that if mom is in that state, it is going to be the feedback mechanism of how that baby's going to come into this world. Another one, I remember a woman came in, had a brain map not too long ago, maybe 2 years ago, with more sophisticated equipment here in the office. And literally what she did when she was looking at her report is she described how much anxiety she has gone through her whole life. But then she began to cry, because all she could. All right, Marcy, cut that out where I was kind of shuffling. So when she was looking at her report, she began to cry. And when I began to try to understand a little bit more about what was going on for her, she was telling me how anxious she could see that her child was already displaying. And I asked her, how old is your child? And she said 4. These ages are so important, and understanding our role as parents is the most critical part of raising a child so that they can be in balance. And that's not to say that we're not going to go through anything. That wouldn't even be realistic. But if you are a person that is going to handle what you have to go through as an adult, or if you are going through something, you're going to get the kind of care that you need so that you can be in the best place that you possibly can be in. Those characteristics are going to have the greatest impact on the regulation of your child. It is very common that around the ages of 2 and 4, that you're going to see more meltdowns in your little toddler. But even with babies, somewhere between 3 and 4 months, there's this idea that there's going to be all this sleep change going on in the baby. And I'm going to be able to pinpoint some neurological function so that, again, it's not just thought of as there's nothing we can do about it, because there is. Number one is to be educated, is to understand that when you're going to have a baby, plan to have a baby. We spend more time planning vacations, maybe planning on being in a marathon, than we do in planning to have a baby. I would recommend that a couple would give 2 years of focus to themselves and their body so that they can be prepared. Now, in my world, I would say I would love to know what your brain looked like. And I would love for you to do functional labs so that you could actually have concrete evidence of where your health state actually is. That same body of research that I was discussing earlier about autism is back in the 80s, where they were looking at why are there so many dysregulated children. And those researchers found back then, over the ages of 30, you were more likely to get an adult onset diagnosis. And those diagnoses are autoimmune, endocrine, diabetes, depression, cancer, and obesity. Those are considered the top 6. But if you were under the age of 30, meaning that you were the offspring of that population that was tested over the age of 30, you were more likely not to get wired up right. Now, we're going to catapult because that research now, well, this is 2023, and that was back in the 80s. It's close to over 40 years old. And what are we seeing today? 1 in 5 kids is not getting wired up correctly. Now the diagnosis statistic for autism is somewhere between 1 in 20 and 1 in 30. When I started my journey 28 years ago, it was like 1 in 150 or 60. You now not only have the diagnosis of pandas, but you've got the diagnosis of PANS, which is all autoimmune. Yes, strep may be the culprit of bacteria, but now it's even far reaching that the immune system is not able to defend itself. Our kids are demonstrating lots of the same types of problems that were actually being researched 40 years ago. So this is why it's imperative that we are looking at our own health. And I'll ask people, so what was your state of health when you got pregnant? Well, I felt great. Feelings are not subjective. They are subjective. They are not objective. And that part is really important because pathology or problems that may finally show up as a diagnosis, those could be decades in the making. And this is why functional labs are far more important than traditional labs, because traditional labs have been changing their within normal limits every year to reflect the averages of what was taken the year before. And if we haven't learned anything over the past 3.5 years, we need to take stock in this, is that the individuals who had greater immune compromise were the ones that did not favor well. If you build your immune system, it will function, but it does take your attention. So that's some background to why it's important as a young couple to plan to have your baby. You are the feedback material for what's going to happen with that child. Now, let's say you've either already had your baby or you're about to have a baby. Don't stay in stress. Be proactive. One of the things that I love about neurofeedback is once the adult actually connects to how this works, they are empowered to know how to change their brain. And your baby needs you. Your baby needs you to be anchored. So no matter what other services you want to put into the mix, when you apply neurofeedback, which is a brain map looking at what's going on in your brain. And then it's actually a functional therapy where you practice being in that correct state and you receive the feedback and you go into a state of self-regulation. That's a very important part of Connect My Brain. We really want our kids and our adults, when they come in, we want this to be the place that they practice. I don't ever want my office to resemble a conveyor belt. I want it to be the space for the individual to understand. And children really can understand. Oh my gosh, yesterday was one of the coolest days. I was working on my own, so I got to have it all to myself, that was fun. But I had a little cherub in here who he wasn't exactly enthused and was demonstrating some attitude. And I did. I have my chat with them. I'm real with them. I think kids really appreciate when you talk to them. And I just, I told them, I said, hey, listen, this isn't what we're going to do right now. You're here. This is your practice time. And it's important for you to be in a positive attitude while you practice. And so by the end of the session, and I'm talking about a little guy too. He's only like 6 years old. And he looked up at me and he said, Dr. Hanson, I am very sorry that I had a bad attitude. I thought I was going to fall on the floor because that was such a growth moment. I think it's so important when you talk to a child, then give them the space to hear it, go through some stuff, let them feel it. And oftentimes they come back around. And in fact, as we wrap up this particular podcast, those are some tools that I'm going to share with you about meltdowns. It is perfectly normal to feel stress and anxiety. In fact, if you don't feel it, you don't get to exercise and practice. And everything about the brain is exercise and practice. What we don't want is that to be the only thing that we're practicing is a meltdown. So 2 to 4 is a very common age. So that's going to be your time to go, okay, what am I going to do to teach this little toddler that this is not the way to go? So first we got to look at that blueprint. Is there an unknown cause that is really demonstrating that there is a dysregulated brainstem going on? And in particular, it's going to be creating, it could really go one of 2 ways. It can be an overactive biological response, or it can be an underactive biological response, depending upon the blueprint. An example of each would be that typical tantrum meltdown that you just cannot console, the typical one that you would think of as overactive. But when we talk overactive, we're also saying this is the only state the child knows how to be in. And so this is a very quick response for them. And no matter what's going on, no matter what you try to do, you are not getting a different response. You may not know how the underactive one looks like, but this is going to be more of the child that kind of pulls away, that withdraws from stuff. So when you have a chance, if you haven't listened to the podcast on withdrawal reflexes and primitive reflexes, I want you to go back and I want you to listen to them, because this is how this stuff got in your brainstem, and why the response is the response is because this is the way we are wired. If we get into an aroused state and a fight or flight response, this is the activity that's going to come forward, because no matter if it's real or imagined, there's a perceived threat, and the toddler 2 to 4 is literally pulling back into that brainstem for responses. And that's where we have to train them. But if we are not regulated, we can't teach regulation. So this age is just so critical for you to look at yourself in combination with your parenting style. Okay. Now, as we are getting older, even going from 4 years to 6 years, you've got more higher brain coming on, not completely, but it's coming on. And now the child's been around long enough to where all of your teaching, your parental styles, approaches that you were using during 4 and 6 are or I'm sorry, between 2 and 4 are expected to pay off. That should be the fruit of your labor, and the response should be different. So let's say you're listening and you've got a child that's 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're just seeing this chronic meltdown. This is where there has to be brain retraining, because the first 7 years, 7 to 8 years of life, and even the third trimester of pregnancy, those were the building of the subconscious mind. And this is where you were completely in charge. You have created, like a computer that doesn't have PowerPoint, Excel, or Word on it yet. So this is why our little ones follow us around like little ducklings, or where that saying comes from, the acorn doesn't fall too far from the tree. So you set the tempo, you set the response, you set the reaction. So you got to look at you. You got to look at you, and you have to do some deep research to say, what part of this is mine, in order to move your child in a different direction. So what do we do for stuff like this at CMB? Connect My Brain. So this is what I'm talking about. You have to understand how the neurology wires and fires together. So if we've got that dysregulation, and that blueprint is demonstrating that maybe there has been heightened emotion in those first 7.5, 8 years of life, maybe there's some trauma. We always have to keep that in mind. And I don't mean just abusive trauma, because there can be that. It can also be children that were adopted. That's very difficult on little nervous systems. But it can also be accidents, physical accidents. I've had lots of children go through here that when they were little absolutely had traumatic brain injuries. Those can be very dysregulating to the sequential development of any child. And so we have to look at that blueprint. We have to see if there are red flags. This is why I love doing brain mapping on children. And as I tell every parent of especially small kids, but even teenagers, they are still so close to the beginning that blueprint that we find in the history is literally going to show us why their brain came online like it did. I have one kiddo here, 8 years old, who has a very loving family, who has done tremendous in this program, but there is still a glitch. And the glitch is when he closes his eyes. And in one conversation that we had recently, I learned he doesn't like to be alone. So no matter how fabulous everything has been, there's this uncertainty of aloneness for him. And when he's alone, that's going to trigger up a fight or flight response. And in fact, while we were doing the brain mapping with the eyes closed, I could see how the brain waves were going. He was literally having a panic attack. So that's what's meant by this dysregulation, and why we have to incorporate the brain into the program. We have to retrain the brain so that it knows how to do it differently. Now, when it comes to very little kids, This is where you have to set it up so that you're looking at yourself, so that you know the pieces that you might need to take responsibility for, and start to re-navigate the path that you're on. If you are pregnant right now, I want you to make whoever is taking care of you, your husband, or maybe you are by yourself, a really good friend. I want them to listen to this podcast because I'm speaking to and for her right now. She needs to be treated as a queen. She is creating a life inside of her. And so, whatever stress she is going through, let's find some solutions and navigate that path in a new direction. And then every day, I want you, for the moms that are married and with their husbands, or the ones that are on their own, I want you to get in a rocking chair and I want you to rock your baby. I want you to hold your baby and I want you to tell your baby, I'm okay. Your job is to grow and develop perfectly as the way you were designed. I am okay. I'm going to get all the help I need to ensure that this environment is right for you to thrive in. So that's beginning steps. If your little toddler is out with you, look at those parenting styles. Whatever you do, be there for your child. If you cannot stay calm and still carry the authority, then what you must do is take a break. If you can stand there and show your child that you're present, but that you are going to expect these boundaries. So let's just say they're throwing a fit over wanting something. Don't give in. When you bribe your child, you are setting up a pattern very early on that they will not do anything unless they get something for it. And I think we all know about all the different sports teams that, regardless if you ever even played, you get a trophy. We have to always keep in mind, one day that child is going to have their first job. There is no magic graduation platform that will take that child from always being given something to do something and magically walk across the stage and it would disappear or grow up. We have to always remember that we are raising future adults. Now, it all needs to be child appropriate, but letting your child know, I'm so sorry that you feel that way, but we're just not buying a toy today. It's not toy day. And let them go through it. And when you're able to console and hug, get right in there. But maybe start to practice teaching that child how to wait for something. And it might be practice for a minute, and then practice for 2 minutes, practice for 3 minutes. But you will certainly begin to see the child move in the direction that you want them to move into because of their age. You know, this idea of trying to reason with someone between the ages of 2 and 4, it is just not concrete to think that they can reason with you. Their brain waves are all over the place. They thrive on boundaries and structure so that they do know which way to go. So I would really encourage you to take a look at your parenting style and where could you kind of tighten it up a little bit. One, almost think about putting imaginary arms around them and giving them the supported boundaries that they need so that they can learn to self regulate. Even self regulation is a developmental journey. Using a pacifier with a baby is fabulous. Sucking is a reflex. That reflex needs to happen. At first, mom sets baby up to the breast, and the baby, she does. She feels like a feeding factory, but she's actually setting up supply and demand. And then we start to use a pacifier after we bypass that time, which teaches the baby to self soothe. All of these pieces of human development, child development, you can trace it all back to the beginning. This whole regulation piece of the response has everything to do with the Moro reflex. And this is a primitive reflex, regardless of all the new information that wants to try to come out. Don't ever disregard primitive reflexes. Every one of us went through them. They are completely part of how we get wired up. They're called central pattern generators, and they begin in the womb. And they're all about teaching that little baby how to self regulate, self motivate, self drive, respect, go after all that life has to give it. But we have to give baby human the opportunity to learn how to do that. Thanks so much for tuning in today. We'll be back to discuss more of different types of mood regulation, anxiety, PTSD, even some oppositional defiance, so that we understand the connection. And if you find some of these truths ringing in your particular history of your child, reach out. We'll have a conversation. If Connect My Brain is the right place for you, we're going to tell you. Be sure to go over to the website, connectmybrain.com, fill out the form, and I will personally get back with you. You're welcome to call the office, 678-501-5172. Be blessed.